You're standing on a beach. The tide pulls back, way back, farther than you've ever seen it go. Fish are flopping on wet sand that should be underwater. Most people today would grab their phone and start filming. But some of your ancestors would have already been running for the hills. Literally. They didn't have seismographs, they didn't have satellite warnings. What they had was something stranger and older. A survival memory passed down through story. On the island of Simeulue, off the coast of Indonesia, there's a word, smong. It means tsunami. But it's also a warning wrapped inside a folk tale told to children for generations. When the ground shakes hard and the sea suddenly vanishes, you run for high ground. No hesitation, no waiting to see what happens next. In 2004, when the Indian Ocean tsunami killed over 200,000 people, Simeulue lost almost no one. Thousands of villagers heard the same rumor their grandparents heard. They ran uphill before the wave even arrived. That's not luck. That's inherited knowledge, encoded in rhythm and rhyme, so it would survive centuries without ever being written down. Geographer Patrick Nunn has spent years studying oral traditions like this one. He's found stories across the Pacific describing coastlines that used to look completely different, sea levels that were once lower, islands that vanished beneath the waves within a handful of generations. Nunn argues these aren't myths dressed up as memory, they're memory dressed up as myth. Here's the strange part. Some of these stories describe events that happened 7,000 years ago, passed down for hundreds of generations, through voice alone. Why would a story survive that long? Because the ones who forgot it didn't survive to tell it again. Natural selection doesn't only shape bodies, it shapes culture too. A tribe that treated a retreating ocean as a curiosity got wiped out. A tribe that treated it as a 5-alarm emergency lived to raise children who believed the same thing. Over time, fear became instinct. Instinct became folklore. Folklore became survival software running quietly in the background of a community's mind. Geologist Brian Atwater found something similar buried in the mud of the Pacific Northwest. Ghost forests of dead cedar trees drowned suddenly by seawater around the year 1700. He matched the evidence to old accounts from indigenous communities describing a night when the earth shook violently and the ocean swallowed the shore. No written records, no instruments. Just a story that turned out to be geologically accurate 300 years later. Ruth Ludwin, a seismologist who worked with tribal historians in the region, helped show these weren't just scary campfire tales. They were data, encoded differently than we're used to, but data all the same. Think about that for a second. Long before anyone understood plate tectonics, communities built an early warning system out of nothing but memory and fear. No technology required, just attention, repetition, and the willingness to believe your grandparents. Compare that to now. You have an entire ocean's worth of scientific data sitting in your pocket. Real-time buoys, satellite altimeters, push notifications that can warn you minutes before a wave hits. And yet, how many people scroll past an emergency alert without a second thought? Maybe the problem isn't that we lack information. Maybe it's that information without a story attached doesn't stick the way fear-coded folklore does. A number on a screen doesn't move your legs. A tale your grandmother told you with real fear in her voice does. There's something almost humbling in that. The people we sometimes imagine as primitive were running early warning networks built entirely out of language, generations before the first seismograph was invented. They didn't need to understand the physics of a subduction zone. They only needed to trust the story enough to move. So the next time the tide pulls back too far and too fast, you might not have a grandmother's warning waiting in your memory. But maybe that's exactly why you should start paying attention to the ground beneath your feet the way they once did. Because the wave doesn't care whether you believe the story. It only cares whether you ran. This same pattern shows up again and again once you start looking for it. Coastal communities in Japan carved stone markers into hillsides, some over 600 years old, warning future generations never to build homes below that line. One inscription near the village of Aniyoshi reads like a message sent forward in time. High dwellings are the peace and harmony of our descendants. Remember the calamity of the great tsunamis. Do not build any homes below this point. In 2011, when a massive tsunami struck the coast, the handful of houses built above that stone survived untouched. The ones built below it, ignoring a warning carved by strangers centuries earlier, did not. You'd think a message like that would fade with time. People forget birthdays. They forget where they put their keys. But somehow, they didn't forget this. Because forgetting had a body count attached to it. That's the quiet engine behind all of these traditions. Not tradition for tradition's sake. Tradition because it was tested again and again against real disasters, and only the versions that kept people alive got passed forward. Every story that survived is a story that worked. Anthropologists call this cultural evolution, and it behaves a lot like the biological kind. Variations appear. Some help, some don't. The ones that help spread faster, get repeated more often, get told with more urgency. Over enough generations, an entire community ends up carrying a kind of instinct that was never written into their DNA at all. It was written into their bedtime stories instead, which raises an uncomfortable question. What have we stopped telling each other now that we assume technology will remember for us?